Welcome to Jesus at the Table, the podcast where we have real conversations about the spiritual journey, cultural issues, and big theological questions.
Well, welcome everyone to another episode of Jesus at the Table. My name is Fran Lehman, and we're glad that you're here joining us for the podcast where pretty much no topic is off limits and where we try to have these conversations as if Jesus were here at the table with us. And I just want to say when we say that, we mean the Jesus that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. We say that all the time. But we're going to have another great conversation today. And with that, I am going to hand it off to my co-host, Leslie Zarita.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Joining us today, obviously, Fran Lehman, the anchor of our podcast and the pastor of LifeSpring Church. And we have Diane, Alicz, and Debbie Jankowski, who are both leaders at LifeSpring. And today we're going to be talking about Christians and the LGBTQ issue. So, Debbie, I'm going to start with you. Let's just get started by maybe having you tell us a little bit about why this issue is important to you.
Sure. I have two adult children that are in same-sex marriages and tried to support them their whole lives, make sure that they're loved and accepted everywhere they go, and especially in church.
Okay, thanks. And Diane, you and your family have been part of LifeSpring for how long now?
Like 24 years.
And what do you and your husband do around the church?
We function as elders.
Okay. Fran,
She says we function as elders, but the truth is they've done a million different things because that's how it is when you plant a church. Church is 30 years old. They've been here 24 years, so they've done a million things. So just want to give you credit.
Thanks for jumping in and adding to that. That's good.
Yeah.
Before we get into this conversation, you gave this podcast, this week's topic, a funny title, and I'm going to have to look here. The Big Kerfuffle, Christians and the LGBTQ Issue. What is up with that?
Well, it's mostly just that I like that word. I came across that word a few years ago, and I like it, kerfuffle. Mm-hmm. It's actually an old Scottish word, and I'm Scottish, so you know. And it means when something becomes a big disorder or chaos or an upset about something. So I like that word about this, and I'm not trying to be facetious about it or something. It's just that this is a big issue. Mm-hmm. It's a big issue, and everybody's talking about it, and people are fighting about it in the church. And so let's just admit that it's a big kerfuffle, and we need to work through it. Something I successfully avoided for a really long time. So
yeah, I think you've said dodged. Dodged might have been the description. So here we are. We're having this conversation today because our own church community has really had an interesting journey with these questions. And we're going to talk about that. But Fran, can you first start out by giving us a historical context as far as Christians and this issue go?
Yeah, so the truth is that just like most of our culture, Christians weren't really talking about this issue until maybe the late 60s, but probably more like into the 1970s. It was just one of those things that everybody knew existed. Yes, there are gay people, but we don't talk about it. And then in the 1970s, kind of as and I'm not tying these completely together, but kind of as the religious right was on the rise, this became one of the issues that was important to a lot of prominent evangelical preachers. And so, I became a Christian in 1976. Late 70s, I started listening to a lot of Christian radio, late 70s, early 80s. And so I was hearing guys like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and James Dobson talking a lot about this issue and saying, very particular things about this issue and about gay people in general and whatever. And then the other thing that happened that historically that I was not aware of at the time at all was something that we now refer to as conversion therapy or mm-hmm. gay conversion therapy. And that was going on really probably beginning in the early 70s. And there were different groups that kind of had this idea that, if you prayed for people enough, if you counseled them enough, if they read enough scripture, if they got close enough to God, they could go from being homosexual to being heterosexual. And eventually all those groups came together under the banner of a large organization that then went on for decades called Exodus International. And so that was kind of a big thing. And through all those things, this became a big issue for Christians. It went from something we didn't talk about to something Christians were talking about all the time. I still remember, oh my gosh, Linda and I were dating. So we got married in 1982, right? So this is about 1980 or 81. It might have been when I met my brother-in-law for the first time, my brother-in-law, Alan. And we're both passionate Christians, young passionate Christians. And I remember we're sitting on the sofa in my in-laws' house, and he said, I've got a question for you. And I said, what? And he said, do you think that a gay person can be a Christian? And I still remember, I just said, well, no, absolutely not. That would be impossible, But I had that opinion because even by that point, so that's 1980, 81, people are talking about it. People are forming strong opinions in the Christian community about it. And then another history piece of this is that as Christians began to embrace more, to talk more overtly about this idea of America as a Christian nation, and that America was, declining, and that we needed to get it back to its Christian place, or however you want to talk about that. Gay people in particular got branded as part of the cause of America's decline. So if we're all trying to save America, and this one particular identifiable group is part of what's bringing the judgment of God on all of us in America, well then we're going to have a big problem with those people. And so that became, I would say, that was probably the thing that caused Christians to begin to other LGBTQ folks in a very direct and kind of overt way, because they were going to ruin our country. And that was how people were talking about it. So, and it's been interesting because I guess this is the other piece of the historical run-up here, as long as I'm rambling on, is that American culture, of course, we all know this, has become more accepting as time has gone on. Certainly not everybody, but there's much more cultural acceptance of gay folks and others in the LGBTQ community. And we've watched mainstream Protestant churches, kind of, many of the larger Lutheran, Presbyterian, Methodist church have said, maybe we need to be more accepting of these folks and not treat them like, lepers, and not treat them like the enemy, or treat them like they can't be people of faith. But that didn't happen in the more conservative evangelical pieces of the church, who tended to move toward regarding those in the LGBTQ community as being under the judgment of God, and that they should be excluded from the community of faith, and embracing the idea that judgmentalism and exclusion reflects the way of Jesus, the way that Jesus would have us to relate to these folks. So
was this always an issue that LifeSpring was focused on? And if not, can you just kind of describe what happened in our church?
Yeah, it definitely was not an issue that we were focused on. In fact, I was really terrible. We alluded to it before, but you said I dodged it. My joke is, and yet it's true, is that I successfully dodged it as a pastor for 25 years because I was taught there's this handful of Bible verses. This is what they say. You don't need to look closer at them. This is the deal. We all know that this set of perspectives about LGBTQ folks represents the solid Christian perspective. And yet I felt compassion. I didn't want to be a judgmental or excluding person, so I felt trapped. And so sometimes when you feel trapped, what you do is you put your head down. And so I put my head down, and even times when other leaders, I remember, Diane, before we ever really addressed this issue, we had some leaders who raised this issue in our eldership team respectfully, lovingly. And I was like, great, what else do we have to talk about on the agenda? Because I just didn't know how to go there. But then a number of years ago, and we had, from time to time, we would have someone who was gay attend the church for a little while. And it was kind of I don't know if this is the right way to describe it. It was kind of a don't ask, don't tell. Like, we would love them and accept them, but it wasn't really talked about. And then a number of years ago, we had a gay couple begin to attend the church, and they loved Christ, and they were married to each other, and they said, "Oh, we just want to be a part of a church community." They told us stories about having been asked to leave church communities, and so it caused kind of an upset because it wasn't a gay person attending our church by themselves. It was a couple. They were clearly a couple. So people recognized that, and there were some people, and I want to be kind here, but there were some people who really wanted them to leave. And there were some people who approached me and in essence asked me to ask them to leave because there wasn't going to be a home for them here. There couldn't be a home for them here. And now you talk about being caught in the middle, right? So I think that was sort of the point where I realized that I couldn't dodge the issue anymore as a leader. I had no idea what was going to happen. None at all. If you would have said, "Fran, do you have a plan for this?" I have no plan. But what I knew, one thing we had to fix. So what I realized was we had to. That this was probably going to be a long conversation, a big conversation, but that we had to answer one question right away because of this couple, which was, when gay folks come to our church, are we going to ask them to leave? Are we going to say, are we going to, and so I sat down with our eldership team. I still remember the night, and I said, I think we need to have a long conversation about this because I have lots of questions that I don't have answers for. But I think we have to answer one question kind of right away, which is, would Jesus meet people at the door of the church and say, "You're not welcome here"? And thankfully, there wasn't a single person on our eldership team who, everybody said, yes, Jesus going to welcome everybody. So we kind of crossed that bridge. So I suggested that we embrace a process. And I was terrified of that process. But we had begun this little community in our church that we call the Crux community. It's kind of like a small group of people who love to read and think, and they want to think about theological things. They want to think about Jesus and the Bible. And they had already worked through one other big topic, and that's their job, is to kind of help us work through big topics. So I said, why don't we hand this to our Crux community and let them begin to work through it? And then we can all double back as leaders and keep communicating about how that process is going, what we're thinking, and those kinds of things. So what happened was, in the long run, I don't know what else we'll talk about here, but in the long run, we landed at a place where we kind of said, everybody's entitled to their opinion. Everybody's a work in progress. I can't say to you, I have a Christian opinion on elephants, and you have to embrace my view on elephants right this second, because the truth is, maybe you're still thinking about elephants, and you got to work through it. So we tried to come to a place as a church where we said, everybody's work in progress. Everybody can keep working through these questions, but no more judgment and exclusion. And so that was kind of where we landed.
Okay. So Diane, let me ask you, you've been here for a long time, and you've been part of leadership for a long time. And all of a sudden, this became a conversation we were going to have. Did it make you nervous to have this conversation for our church?
Well, yeah, because we've been through many upheavals in the past, and it does make you nervous that you're going to have to be at the center of that storm. So, yeah, it made me nervous, but we also couldn't dodge it anymore.
The dodge is over.
Yeah.
So, Debbie, you and Dave started coming to LifeSpring when we were kind of in the middle of this conversation and in this process and asking these questions. And you'd been very involved in a church. So what caused you to go looking for a different church that was more affirming and less judgmental?
Because that church was still dodging the issue and did not want to have, they were willing to have conversations, but they weren't willing to open their heart and mind and think about something new and learn something new possibly. They just wanted to continue to believe what they had been taught and believed in the church, historically in their family, in the church itself. They just weren't open to that. And we watched them hurt people, and I just couldn't stay anymore and watch them hurt people who didn't deserve to be hurt and were amazing Christ-following people that were just living their life like we are living our lives, you know? So we just couldn't stay anymore and watch that.
So what made you stick around a church that wasn't yet sure where it would land? When you came to our church?
because you guys came in and we were still in process. I mean, there were emails kind of you remember that on the front end, like, hey, where's your church with this? And I'm like, well, we're having a conversation. And yeah.
Well, we had been, they call it church shopping. And I think in the process of that, for me anyway, I kind of learned what I needed and what I didn't need in a church anymore. Obviously, I needed an affirming church, but the big stage and the lights and all of that, like I felt like that was something I needed. But then after going to different churches, I realized, no, I really need the message to be something deep and meaningful. And
we have a smaller stage and smaller lights.
But they're just as amazing. Just as amazing. So we had open conversations with Fran and Linda, and we came along the journey with two other couples, and we all talked with you. We all met with you. We felt like you were being really transparent, and we were really impressed that you guys were talking through this and deeply talking through it, and not just, well, those 6 Bible verses and that's what they mean. Like you were literally, researching the language and the meanings and what was going on. So we all said if you didn't go affirming, we were going to leave, and we were going to be really sad about that. But, we were super hopeful that you would,
Right.
decide to be affirming. And we also liked the way that it was taking time, although we were very impatient. My husband was extremely impatient. He just wanted you guys to just make the decision because we were already there. Like you said, we're there. So it's not that we expect everyone to be there with us, but we sort of do.
So that's sort of news to me because none of you expressed that, because I think you treated, and I'm grateful for this, you respected the fact that we had felt as a church we needed to work a process with this, and that had to happen for the sake of all the people who were here before you came.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's part of why we stayed. We liked that about where you were going with it, how long it was taking, and you were including the, congregation in the conversations, and you invited us to speak and in those conversations. So we felt, at least if we were part of trying to make a change, then that's great. And if it didn't end up that way, then we would have to find something else, because that was really our bottom line was, we wanted to be at an affirming church.
Yeah. Fascinating.
So were you surprised to find that a Bible-believing evangelical church with contemporary worship was actually having these conversations?
Yes, very. Yeah, we all were. I mean, like I said, we came from a church that was not willing to even talk about it. In meetings, it was shut down. Staff meetings, it was shut down. The conversation was shut down. And that's what we wanted, a more contemporary worship service, Christian, Bible-based, with deep teaching, and we found LifeSpring. So at the right time, I feel God brought us here at the right time.
Yeah,
so.
For us as well.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember thinking we could work through this whole issue, right? And then no other person in the LGBTQ community or a parent, someone like yourself, will ever walk through our door again, and it'll be like, well, good thing we worked through those questions, right? And here we are in the middle of this process, and you guys walk through the door. Well, emailed first, and then walk through the door, and you're here, and then you kind of joined the process, and you actually became kind of a significant part of that process, because you guys and other people that you knew beyond, the couple of couples that you guys were, had stories to tell, and we said, would you tell us those stories? And it was like it was one of those journeys where you set out on a journey and you might have some idea how it's going to unfold, but there's pieces of it I didn't see coming, and you guys were one of those pieces, and people you knew were some of those pieces. And anyway,
Yeah.
I'll shut up.
And I have to just say, like, thank you to you and Dave and to the other couples. I'm not going to name all kinds of names without, their permission. Thank you for being so transparent and so vulnerable, because I think it would have been more difficult for us to walk through that process and to have a good picture of what we needed to consider without hearing those stories. And the fact that you guys were able to be so willing to share such personal things to you and your family, I'm just super appreciative, and I just want to say that.
Well, we're appreciative that you let us.
Yeah,
and I feel like the word issue is just like,
I
it
hate
just
that
makes
word.
me
I
cringe
hate that
because
word.
my son and son-in-law aren't issues. My son and son-in-law are humans made in the image of God, living a life like me and my husband live. Like, they're just going to work, they love each other, they love their family, we love them. Like, there's no issue there.
Right.
So, yeah. And to have them be an issue at church, to me, was just, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting what you brought up, Leslie, though, that these guys came in, Debbie, and you know, both of the couple of times that I asked you to kind of tell your stories, once in our smaller Crux community and once in front of our whole congregation, I felt like I was asking something I shouldn't be asking, like it's vulnerable territory. And you guys were like, yes. And I was like, oh my gosh, so. But really, I think we can blame Diane, because I think that what led to the Sunday where you guys and this other couple were up front telling your stories in front of our whole congregation, I think that was actually Diane's suggestion. So,
I think it was Diane's
yeah,
suggestion,
so anyway.
which was a good thing. Speaking of Diane,
Okay.
can you describe your journey with, I don't want to say this issue, but I'm going to say this issue, and with the conversation that unfolded?
Yes. It wasn't the issue, sorry. Wasn't
Can you
something
give us a
that
better
was-
term? Because I hate saying that too.
I don't know.
The topic.
The topic.
Topic.
Okay, the topic. Wasn't something that was forefront in my journey because it didn't affect me personally. I mean, not that I didn't have family members that were gay, but they never came out to me, and it was never part of my relationship with them. So I knew what the Christian thought was about it, but I didn't really think about it that much. And I always wanted to be loving to anybody who walked through our doors. But I also didn't think about the personal side of it. I didn't know the stories. And then you guys told us your story. I mean, after we had gone through the Crux thing and looked at the passages very deeply, and then you see how ambiguous a lot of those passages are. And then you guys told us your stories that night, and it was so moving. I mean, as a mother, I can't imagine. And to have your kid feel like that they are not loved by God, that they are not accepted by God because of the way Christians are treating them, is horrible. Because God is love, and you're not worthy of it. So it just really hit me, and I thought, if we're going to move forward in this journey with our entire congregation, which I think part of it, like, we did go slow because we were trying to bring people along and not have them go, I don't believe that, and just take off. I just thought that people need to hear these stories and put a face on it, that, the suffering that your children had to go through simply because of how they were born it's just really sad. And I don't want to be a part of somebody making people feel like they're not inherently good enough.
Right.
So that's why I said everybody needs to hear their stories, not just us.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you kind of alluded to this when you talked about, having that realization as a mother. Were there any other kind of aha moments, especially as you went through the process with the Crux community, or things that were maybe more difficult or more important to you that came out of those conversations that you were having?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation with the Crux community was eye-opening. I'll tell you the truth, I never really looked that closely at those passages because it wasn't important to my life. So I never really, I wasn't like, well, in Romans, Paul said this. I never thought about it that much. But then when Fran when we were going through the history and the etymology of the words and what was going on during that time, you're like, this is ambiguous. This isn't just black and white. Hey, this is it. And I think as Christians and as people, the Bible, we want the Bible to be a set of rules. Instead of revealing truth to us, we want it to say, this is how you treat every single thing. And that's not what the Bible is. I mean, that's not how Jesus taught. He taught in parables. He taught in ways to make you think. He revealed truth. He did not reveal rules. He did not reveal that this is exactly the way you have to go. So it does make it more difficult. I mean, it would be nicer if he would just have told us everything, and But so there was a lot of things where, I guess, knowing that it was ambiguous. Then we watched that documentary about the conversion therapy, which was horrifying.
Pray Away. Yeah, if people have not watched, we should say that if you've never watched the Netflix documentary Pray Away about gay conversion therapy, do yourself a favor and become historically informed and watch it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the fact that Christians think that things like this are black and white and that you can just, change your sexuality is such a ridiculous oversimplification. I mean, so anyway, that was part of it. But then the other eye-opening thing is that I didn't realize how I was not considering how people were being treated in the Christian community, that it wasn't, that I didn't, it's like I didn't care. And not, if I had met them, I would care. But you know what I mean? It's like, it wasn't something that I thought about or did anything about. So it wasn't like I was like, yeah, people can come in the church and we'll be fine, but that's not how they feel when they come in the door.
Yeah, I get that, because you're like saying, I wasn't overtly doing this, but at the same time, I was, you feel sort of, come to a place you feel sort of complicit.
Well, I wasn't doing anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that it's like you have an indifference because it's not something you're experiencing. So it's easy to kind of say, well, that's happening over there and I don't have to think about it.
And I think the church, there are churches that say all are welcome, but that's not, you might be welcome in the door, but then there's a stop at some point of what you can do in the church.
Well, yeah, you're welcome, but you can't teach our kids.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, what a
You're welcome,
horrible
but you
thing.
can't serve. You're
Well,
welcome,
yeah, I
but
mean,
you can't.
You can serve, but you can't be a leader.
Or I've run into this. You're welcome for a while, as long as you're changing, and
Right. Or
Yeah.
you're not in a relationship, then you
Yeah,
can do this,
right,
and
yeah.
all of those other details. So language is important. I don't know. I don't think that churches believe that. I
Well, you
think they
guys
believe-
kind of schooled us in the limitations of
Yeah.
saying that you're welcome.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know. Yeah.
And
And
that
it's-
actually sends a different message than the message that you think you're
Right.
sending.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, Fran, as we've been talking about the journey that our church, LifeSpring, has taken with all of this, the debate that exists about this topic is actually bigger across American culture, not smaller. Our church is one example of this bigger picture. So what kinds of things is that debate centered in?
Well, the first thing I want to point out is that Diane just used the word etymology, and I knew I liked you. So, because etymology, which is the study of where words come from, their origins in other languages and other times, is just one of my favorite things.
I would say that speaks your language.
That
That's
speaks
no
my
pun- no
language
pun
right
intended.
there. So what things that, this is a big topic in American culture and the American church. So what is it centered in? It's centered a lot in the Bible arguments, right? Because there's been a lot of ink spilled about the five, what are considered sort of the five relevant passages. Sometimes if you don't like the way people are using them, they've sometimes been called the clobber passages, but I'll call them the five relevant passages. There's been a lot of debate about those. And the interesting thing is that most people who are using those passages, and this to some degree, would have been me a number of years ago and across my adult Christian life. But most people are using those passages to pronounce judgment or to form a basis for exclusion of people from the community of faith, or to demand that people change their sexuality or whatever, do certain things with their sexuality. Most people who are using those Bible passages in those ways do not really know very much at all. And that was me too, about the historical context in which those passages were written, about the particular language and the words that were used, about things like how homosexual acts were part of ancient pagan worship rites, or in the time of, that's going back maybe to the time of Leviticus even, but in the time of Jesus, how were these things, how was homosexuality visible in the culture? Because it's different from how it is in our culture. Do we understand that? Have we studied it? Have we had conversation about it? There's also a question, I think, about how we read the Bible in general, which is not the topic of this podcast, and it's a larger topic than just this. But there is a larger question about how we read the Bible. Diane kind of alluded to it before, that the Bible isn't dropped from heaven as a sort of dictated book that is written like a textbook. If you need the answer to this question, go to page 163, and there God says, oh, you're asking this question as a modern 20th century person. Here's the answer, tailored just for you. It's not like that. It takes careful reading. It takes some discernment about the cultural context. Sometimes we say, I like Greg Boyd's term, the cultural conditioning of the writers, what's the framework they were thinking in. And yet we do believe, as Christians and here at LifeSpring, that Scripture is inspired and that God has preserved the revelation of himself to all kinds of people, and specifically through Jesus in Scripture. So we are lovers of Scripture, studiers of Scripture, but it still raises questions about sort of how you read Scripture. And whether you read it carefully, and whether you factor in what's going on around all those texts, which I think one of the things that we don't like about that is that also requires work, right? We might have to study more, listen more, seek out different perspectives or different information. So, but I also think, how can I say this? I also think that one of the places this whole conversation in the broader church is centered, or that's maybe even the wrong way to put it. One of the things we should all realize we're doing, is that we're answering questions like this, like questions like, what about gay people? We're answering them within a context of how we frame our thinking about the gospel and the Christian journey. So we have tended, and I'll speak for us as evangelical type folks, as distinct from, say, conservative Catholics, we have tended to talk about the gospel primarily in terms of, well, Jesus died on the cross so we could be forgiven, and so we could go to heaven when we die. And because of that, I would say we have not thought deeply enough about the more transformative elements of what it means to be on a Christian journey. A friend of mine once humorously quipped that the way we'd embrace the gospel was, you know you're forgiven and you're going to heaven, and for God's sake, try to be good until then, you know? So because what we haven't thought about is, if God is restoring human beings and making all things new and making us new, where is that centered? And one of the most interesting things that we find in Jesus' teaching in the Gospels is he moves the locus of transformation from the external things, right? Just think Pharisees and counting your steps on the Sabbath, and don't use your milk dishes for your meat, and all this kind of stuff. And Jesus moves the locus of transformation from the external things to this internal place, and he says, don't you realize that everything good or bad that comes out of a person starts in the heart? The good man brings out good things that already were living inside him in his heart. The evil person brings out evil things. So this is important because, for me, it raises this question. So if what I'm being transformed into is this person who is less afraid because I know the love of God, and I'm changed by love, and I'm being transformed into a person capable of love, and I believe in goodness in every way that it that it can live among us and in us as human beings. And I started to wrestle with this. So can that happen for a gay person?
Right.
But if you think the locus is all external, you're very focused. So and not just that question of sexuality, you could be focused on a lot of things and say, well, if you're on a transforming Christian journey, it's got to look like this and this and this and this and this. Jesus moves it here and says that it transforms us internally. And then when it comes out, the prime evidence of it is love. And you go, oh. So I think we have to do a lot of thinking. I'm not trying to fully answer the question, but I'm just saying I think we have to do a lot of thinking about what do we think the Christian journey is and how. So I think sexuality is a big thing about people. It is a big thing about us. It's a powerful thing within us. But I don't think it defines what Christian transformation is.
Right.
And so those are important questions for me. And then lastly, I would just say it's centered in the question of seeing people. And I'll probably make some people mad with this, but this was me too. So I'm not putting this on everybody else. When you other people and you say, oh, you're under the judgment of God, you're excluded from the community of faith, you stop seeing them. And you might sit here and say to me, oh, no, I'm not, Pastor Fran, I don't stop seeing them. But you do, because what you're saying is, I'm only looking at your one major disqualifying issue. Mm-hmm. And then I've often joked that it would be like if I heard a group of people talking and my name came up and somebody said, oh, well, the only thing you need to know about Fran Lehman is he's heterosexual. And then everybody went, oh, well, And it'd be like I would be standing on the edge of that crowd going, wait a minute, there's way more to me than just that. There is that, but there's more to me.
Well, that's something that's been odd to me, is thinking about, I have never walked through the doors of any church and somebody say, oh, what's your sexual orientation? That's going to judge whether you can be here or not be here. It's going to determine in our minds if you are a valuable person or like. My sexuality has never been questioned when I've walked through a church ever.
Right.
Okay, Debbie and Diane, I have one last question for both of you, so you guys are going to have to kind of figure out who's going to answer first, okay? There are probably people who are listening to this or watching this who've been at a very conservative place on this topic, and they're really unsure about rethinking it. So what would you say to them, or how would you encourage them?
That's a good question. I would just ask people to ask themselves if they do have conversations and research and learn and have a conversation with an open heart about this topic, and they do feel like they're going to change their mind or their heart towards this and something they've always believed and been taught, then ask themselves, if I do change what I'm thinking, then what does that do for yourself? Like, does that mean you're no longer a good Christian? God doesn't love you. You're now, thinking something wrong. Like, just, think about what it means to you to actually have conversations with people. I'm sure, everybody knows somebody that's gay. They just maybe they haven't had deep conversations or conversations to get to know someone. So I would also ask that you get to know a person or a couple, a same-sex couple, get to know them, learn their story. And I would hope that after learning and hearing their story that you might have a little bit of a change of heart towards the topic and towards what you've always been taught.
I think I love what you just said, Debbie. I think a lot of us, it was implied to us, if not overtly taught, that if we rethought this or certain other big questions, that was very, very dangerous. Mm-hmm. And something very, very bad would happen. And I love that you're kind of saying to people like, is that true? That something really bad is going to happen? Like, because I know God's still going to love you. And you're still going to be a Christian. And you might even get better at loving other people. So don't be. It's like the kid said in Home Alone. Don't get scared now. So.
All right, Diane, how about you?
I understand where somebody would be coming from, where they'd be afraid of falling on the wrong side of this or going against God because they sincerely want to follow God, and I get that. But if your belief is true, then it also deserves to have scrutiny. You can't say, if you've never looked at it, if you've never investigated it, you cannot say for certain that this is what God says. If you're just keeping it on the surface and saying, nope, I'm a Christian and that's what Christians believe, that's not fair. And I think too, you need to put a personal face on this, that these are people and they're important, and you can't just dismiss that God dismisses them and that the entire group, they're not important to God, and they're like, he just cursed them to not have a full life, to not to be fully in his love. So if I don't think you can even have an opinion if you're not even willing to look at it.
Right. I love what you said about your truth needs to have scrutiny, because I think that is so important, because otherwise you're not fully vetting that, whatever that truth is. And I think that's hugely important.
And you said something really important, which is you recognize, and I want to say that I recognize, right, as the pastor of our church, and sometimes the guy with the big mouth about a lot of things, people are trying to be faithful, right? And I get that. They're trying to be faithful. And but maybe we still have to ask some hard questions, because maybe our faithfulness can actually grow, right? Maybe we can keep the parts of faithfulness we had, and we can become faithful in some new and good ways too.
Yeah.
So,
All right, we're almost out of time. I have one more question for you, and then I have something I want to say.
Okay.
Are we going to talk about this topic more? And if so, what does that look like?
yeah, what I'd like to do, because what we're doing we're in the early launch of our Jesus at the Table podcast. So we're doing a lot of one-off topics because we're trying to give people, we want to build a listenership, and we want people to be like, wow, they're going to talk about all kinds of interesting things. So we're kind of diving into a lot of different stuff. But we'd like to come back to some of those topics, including this one, and unpack them in a little fuller way. So I'd like to come back and have more conversations about this. Like, I'm sure that somebody is listening to this or watching this, and they are saying, well, you haven't done anything to convince me about the Bible arguments.
Right.
Because we can't fit that in a little introductory conversation like this. And so I'd like to do an episode where we just talk about the Bible passages. And I'd like to do some episodes where we talk about some history, and I'd like to do some episodes where maybe we have some of our LGBTQ friends on the show with us. So yeah, I'd like to come back and I don't know, do 3-4 episodes together about this whole topic, and maybe from time to time, kind of come back around. I don't think this issue is going away anytime soon in the broader church. I think we have to keep talking about it. So,
I agree.
Yeah,
absolutely. So before we wrap things up, I just have to say, I'm really loving your shirt today. You want to talk about that at all?
my podcaster shirt.
Yeah, I'm a little envious.
I do.
I'm just gonna
Okay.
say I'm
All right,
slightly envious. I'm your co-host, and I don't have one.
Maybe we can get one, but yours would have to be a different color. So the story behind this shirt is that we have a friend here at church, Kat Killian, and she has a podcast, and she walked into church or some event, we had something one day, and she was wearing a shirt just like this. I think it was a different color. And I was like, well, I'm starting a podcast. I said, where do I get a podcaster shirt? And so Wednesday night, just this week, she walked into Bible study and she said, I have a present for you.
Ah, nice.
And she gave me my podcaster shirt. And I said, I'm going to wear that this week.
So this is where I say, Kat, hook a sister up.
I love it. I love it.
So I want to really thank both of you for joining us. I mean, I would love to talk more. We, have a finite amount of time. It's definitely a topic that's extremely important to me, as it is to you guys, and hopefully we can kind of bring you on and talk some more about it. I also want to thank all of you who've watched. We always appreciate your viewership, and you've piggyback on that right now.
I can. So before you go, if wherever you happen to be listening or watching, if you would like us and subscribe, that will help other people find us, especially if you're listening somewhere to the audio podcast where you can do a rating or a review. We would love that. That will help other people find us. And if you would like to join our email list or learn more about us, you can go to our website, which is jesusathetable.com. And until next time, We'll see you then when we come back together for more conversations with Jesus at the table.